I'm Janet Cox from Fossil Free California, and I'm so excited that you're all here. This is going to be a really exciting couple of panels that are going to change the world. I'm not really exaggerating. We're thrilled to have Bill McKibben here, and Ellen Dorsey and Catherine Howard. They will be introduced to you shortly. This is going to be really interesting, and I'm just so happy to see everybody here. I'll just keep gushing, so I'm going to stop talking. Over to Bill and Catherine and Ellen. Thank you all.
I think I'm to say a few words first, just a few. This really is a grand occasion to be here. When we talk about the, I don't know, does everybody still read Tom Sawyer? You know the amazing scene in Tom Sawyer where he whitewashes the fence and shows himself to be having so much fun doing it that he's able to convince everybody else to come actually do the rest of the whitewashing. That's how I feel like with divestment. It's true that some of us sort of at the very beginning kind of got it going, but then I've happily stepped back and let everybody else do immense and huge amounts of labor, and all that labor all over the world has paid off in the most extraordinary ways. Maybe Ellen and I can recap a little bit the sort of what you and everybody else were talking about yesterday at this kind of celebration we did of where we are at the moment. There are now over 1,000 institutions around the planet that have divested from fossil fuel with $6.24 trillion, is that right? Roughly. Yep. Which is an unbelievably large sum of money, like literally unbelievable. I mean, we had no idea when we began this that it would grow to anything like that size. Now the kind of the charismatic institutions that are taking this up month after month, each one of them spurs it on to sort of greater heights. It's really powerful to have Dan Zarilli here, and you'll hear from him later today to talk about New York City, whose decision to divest in January of this year was an epic moment in this campaign. And just when we thought that would be the sort of talking point of the whole year along, to almost match it came the remarkable news that the entire country of Ireland had decided to divest. And each one of these took enormous amounts of work from all sorts of people on the ground. None of this, these conversations have to be started and nurtured over the course of years in place after place. And because when we started, and this is the kind of point I begin to, this was a kind of new idea that seemed a little scary and whatever to the boards and trustees and politicians and whoever were like. The point that I think we should be making this afternoon is that's no longer the case. We've now passed some kind of intellectual tipping point with divestment where really one should have a harder time explaining why they're not divesting than why they are, okay? At this point, sheer logic of every kind, from financial logic, at this point obvious data showing that it's a smart financial decision, to the moral logic that's been clear from the beginning, points you in the direction of divesting. And the real question is, why would anyone at this point any longer want to be invested in that small band of rogue firms whose business model, carried out to its conclusion, would destroy the one planet that we have? So, I think that there'll be no problem meeting the target that Ellen has set for us all of 10 trillion by 2020. More to the point, I think that there'll be no problem driving this conversation further and further and further into more and more and more places. We celebrate when we win these divestment fights, but you know what? Even when we don't win them, we win them, because the sheer act of raising these questions over and over again, putting them in the face of the powerful and the rich and the connected, even campaigns that haven't won yet. Abby, I'm looking at you. The people have put incredible amounts of effort into have been just as much a part of this success as the campaigns that have so far succeeded. And so I guess what I'm trying, I think that one of the places where we're going to move the ball forward today, sort of help this conversation go on to the next level, is by talking about what it now means to be a fiduciary, how we're coming to understand that in a different light, in a sense, than we did just a few years ago. When I started talking about it some years ago, the best that I could do to kind of express it was to say, it clearly made no sense to be planning for people's retirement funds by producing a planet on which it would not be worth retiring. It is not sensible in any larger sense to be paying for someone's college education with investments in companies that would render the world an impossible place for people to carry out whatever profession they've been trained for, you know. That those very sort of, but now we've reached the point where we've got a sharper point on those questions, where we're able to frame them in ways that are financially and legally powerful too. And that's really, I think, what we want to talk about as much as possible here. So I'm going to shut up so that we can listen to the people who are really doing heavy lifting on this topic. Catherine Howard from the UK, from Share Action, is doing unbelievable work, and I have no doubt that there are plenty of boards of trustees that shake a little when her name is mentioned. Just as I know that that Ellen Dorsey has scared the heck out of all kinds of people who deserve to have the heck scared out of them. She and her colleagues, people like Claire Wonders, just managed to take this issue in new directions. And so I know, I see my colleagues Jamie Henn and Brett Fleischman up there who have worked on this from the very start. I know that we're really curious to kind of hear the latest about how these things are developing in your mind. So I'm going to sit down by asking the question really maybe of both of you, but just starting off with you, Ellen, just explain why it is that fossil fuel, at this point, that it's the exact opposite of being a fiduciary to invest in fossil fuel. Is that okay?
Great.
Good.
Do I need to get up or can you hear me?
You can get up.
This one, is it okay? Is that working?
No.
Do I have to turn it on? It seems like it's on. It's green.
Yeah?
There you are. There you are.
Okay, so I direct a foundation, the Wallace Global Fund, and back in 2009 we started divesting our endowment from fossil fuels, which we completed in 2011. We were 100% fossil free, and other polluting industries and utilities, and we're 16% invested in climate solutions, with 1% devoted to energy access, energy poverty globally, and we recently made $1 million commitment to invest in a wind farm at Standing Rock. So we really believe in the power of what our investments can do. So, we have been supporting the fossil fuel divestment movement from its inception. And in 2013, I sat down with my board and said, listen, we need to organize philanthropy as a sector of the movement. And we need to do this for a number of reasons. One, because we can help put wind at the back of the students that are fighting these campaigns on campuses. We can kind of use the social legitimacy of philanthropy. Secondly, we can demonstrate, for instance, our own investment portfolio. We can hold up that examples of investment portfolios that are divested and are bringing successful returns. Third, we would help create a market for fossil-free products, help drive a market for fossil-free products. And fourth, we could shake up philanthropy, which badly needed to be shaken up, and kind of pull back the black curtain between, or the wall between investments and program, which I would love to come back to at another point. So, to date, we now have 175 foundations worldwide that not only have committed to divest, but also invest 5% of their portfolios in the solutions. Clara has worked with me on this. And in addition to that, many other foundations have done it but won't commit publicly. That's another story and kind of embarrassing for them, because they're on the right side of history by doing it, and they could help build the movement, but they don't want to come out. But as a result of forming Divest Invest Philanthropy, I've now spoken to dozens and dozens and dozens of investment committees and boards of trustees about the decision. And we did that deliberately, peer-to-peer organizing. They could bring me in, I could bring in my investment guy, and we would sit down with them and explain how to do it. Of course, the number one argument that immediately is uttered by virtually everyone is, oh, fiduciary duty, we can't threaten the risk of return, da da da. What always, and that's actually an effort by the investment professionals to stymie your opening up their control over the money. I mean, that is fundamentally what they're doing, is saying, I run the money, you stay on your side of the table. Now, fiduciary duty is a legal obligation. First of all, there are no fiduciary police. I do realize the IRS stands as the fiduciary police, but look at the Trump Foundation, that's all I'm going to say. Second, it assumes that divestment is a threat to returns, which of course we know it is not, and we'll spend a little time talking about. But just yesterday at the State of the Divestment announcement, world-renowned investor Jeremy Grantham stood up and laid out 90 years of research that says under ordinary circumstances, you could eliminate any one sector to your investment portfolio and it would have negligible impacts on your returns. 90 years of research, no matter whatever the sector is. But third, these are not normal times. We are in the middle of a global energy transition. So that sector is particularly unstable. And what that says is that brings a climate risk to your portfolio that the fiduciaries must pay attention to. So what is that climate risk? It's the volatility of the industry now. It's peak oil by 2023. It's the pace of adoptions of renewables. It's the cost competitiveness of renewables. It's the fact that the data shows that fossil fuels returns over the last 5 years have been the worst performing sector, bar none, at the level of treasuries. So you get the risk of equities and the returns of bonds. So you look at all of those component pieces, and right now you know that there is a threat to the performance of your portfolio. You add on to that the stranded asset risk analysis, which Bill brilliantly popularized the work of Carbon Tracker, and you see that that financial risk is only growing. Add two other variables. The one is climate litigation. So if you're a fiduciary and you know the sector's not doing so well now, all the analysis says it's going to be a problem in the future, and oh my God, the companies are being sued, and they're being sued for damages. When those suits are successful, that is a material risk to the investors that the industry is vulnerable to. And then divestment itself is a risk, a material risk. Shell's latest annual report actually laid that out, that the divestment movement is a material risk. So when you add all that together alone, you understand that this sector is moving, it has moved into such a fragile state that if you as a fiduciary are not analyzing the climate risk to your portfolio, you are in violation of your fiduciary duty. I don't think the police are going to come and get you, but I think the argument is pretty clear.
Yeah. Catherine, how does the argument look on the other side of our common law in this world began on the other side of the Atlantic? How do these questions look there?
Sure.
And just tell us how things are developing in Europe.
Right, well, first of all, fantastic to be here for this amazing week of action and to be on stage with these two heroes of mine. I am, alongside being at Share Action, I'll say a little bit about the work that we're doing and the impact we're having on this fiduciary duty debate in a second, but I'm also on the board of The Guardian, a news organisation that was inspired to start an incredible Keep It in the Ground campaign by Bill's amazing work, which has a very large endowment, which the editor and the board members agreed a number of years ago. We can't have this editorial line and not walk the walk as well. So we made a major divestment decision, and I have to say, it's been a great investment decision. Very proud of that. The work that we do at Share Action, we're an NGO that's been campaigning for change in the pensions industry in our country and in the investment industry for 12 years. And what we've been fighting for a long time is for the law to recognize that there's a serious problem if trustees or fiduciaries, people who have a legal obligation to look after your best interests, are willfully ignoring the financial risks of not just climate change, but actually a wide range of sustainability factors that are influencing corporate performance and investment performance. And what's exciting about being on this panel today is that this morning, the UK government released new regulations that will require trustees of UK pension funds to put out a statement showing how they take account of environmental, social, and governance risk. And the words climate change, for the first time are in UK law requiring proper risk management by trustees. So that's actually... It's a very, very exciting moment, and we've been fighting for that for God knows how long. Actually, the fight for change in fiduciary duty really started to gather pace because of two things. One was the financial crisis 10 years ago, which revealed that somehow risk management seemed to just need a real careful look at. Huge numbers of pension fund members on both sides of the Atlantic and all over the world suffered serious losses, while the investment managers who had looked after their savings and secured huge bonuses year after year for doing so, kept their bonuses, walked away. The losses were incurred by regular folks who really had to start asking more questions about, are these financial professionals fit for purpose in looking after the risks I face? But the other driver for a review of fiduciary duties is the climate crisis, because for the reasons Ellen has just laid out, there's a fundamental shift and transformation coming, which will have huge implications for investment returns and portfolios. But we need to go further, because actually we absolutely need to be demanding that it's not just a sort of financial risk management. It's actually, as Bill said earlier, about recognizing that if you look after someone's assets, you need to think about the impact of your investment decisions on the world they will live in. This is still, in a way, we haven't yet won the argument in taking it to that new extent, but what is exciting in the regulations that have been announced this morning is not that we've got everything we want, but we've got actually a major step forward in recognizing that trustees must consult and listen to the views of the beneficiaries. Trustee law and common law on fiduciary duties kind of emerged out of a very patrician world in the 19th century, and actually out of a kind of legal tradition in which people would put aside money that was for sort of widows and orphans and people that hadn't contributed. But a pension fund is a fund where you put the money in and yet your views don't have to be listened to in the way that money is invested. And that's kind of, I think, the next frontier of the arguments we need to make about fiduciary duty, that it's my money, and I not just deserve to be, I should be consulted on the decisions that are made, because those decisions have an impact on my world. And actually, when I think about what inspired me into sort of activism and the work I do today, I look back at the suffragettes were my kind of great heroes. And the arguments used for why women shouldn't have the votes are eerily familiar when you hear the arguments used why regular pension fund members shouldn't, shouldn't be involved in the decisions. Well, the first argument is they don't want to be. That was the argument used, that women didn't actually want the vote. It was just a small, tiny little fragment of people over there. But the amazing, the divestment movement proves that millions of people are very interested in a conversation about what happens to their money. So that was the first argument. The other one was, that, of course, that women, just weren't suitable. They didn't have the intelligence. They just didn't have the grip on these kind of things. That's also very familiar. Now, this world of investment is just a bit too complicated for you guys. So I think what we need is a movement for reform of, it's a terrible phrase in a way, fiduciary duty, because it's the sort of thing, along with the word pension fund, that makes people want to fall straight asleep. But actually, it's where ordinary people interact with the capitalist system. It's our retirement savings that fuel everything that goes on in the corporate world. And of course we have an interest, and we deserve a seat at the table. So I feel we're making some amazing gains, not just in the UK, but actually in the rest of Europe. There's some really interesting legislation coming up the track at the European Union level. But we actually need to go deeper and further and be even more ambitious, that it's about having a seat at the table when decisions are made over things that we have an interest with our money.
One of the things that's been interesting, and I think it's really coming to a head right now, and I'd love to sort of both of you talk about it a little bit. At the beginning of this fight, the kind of standard, the version of this, to sort of tell activists to go away and stop bothering, was to say, well, we're going to engage with the companies involved here, and we'll take care of the problem by having some meetings with them or voting some proxies or whatever. That seemed unlikely to us at the time. And as it happens, it's proved to be entirely exercise in futility. I think one of the things we really need to underline this week is the release of this latest round of reporting, studies on this question of engagement, As You Sow, which is a wonderful organization that specializes in shareholder engagement. They've done great work over the years across a wide variety of industries in getting companies to change behavior through shareholder engagement. They put out a report earlier this week that, Ellen, I hope you'll talk a little more about, but it says well, two things. The first thing it says is, by not divesting, companies, pension funds and others are losing huge amounts of money. I think the figure they used for New York State's Common Retirement Fund was the equivalent of $14,000 per member of the retirement fund. That's how much more they would have had the state merely divested when we asked them to some years ago. $14,000 is beginning to mount into the area of real money, for at least for some of us. But the second thing, and maybe more important, was they said it's entirely clear now, after looking at a couple of 100 examples, that the engagement process with the fossil fuel industry does not work. It does not produce change. It does not get them close to complying with scientific targets. I don't think this is any huge mystery, really. We thought from the beginning that this would be impossible because the thing that we needed to engage with them on was, in fact, the core business model, not some flaw at the edge of the business model. But, Ellen, what does that mean for among other things, how long can you keep pretending that you're engaged in this action? What do the next couple of years hold? How does it work, do you think?
Well, first of all, I think this is a really crucial issue, and in full disclosure, we commissioned that study that As You Sow released because we said, look, all of the big institutional investors, the really large pension funds, including California's, are saying we need to engage with the companies. We have to have a seat at the table. We have to orchestrate with them the wind down. And I would say a number of critically important things. First, this report surveyed all of the engagement that has happened, the resolutions that have been tendered, the shareholder resolutions. They've surveyed all the engagement with the fossil fuel companies and analyzed their results. And basically said there might be a little incremental win here on, methane or something there, but the resolutions themselves have not been fit for purpose. They aren't demanding of the companies a 2 degrees business plan of managed decline by date certain with clear benchmarks on the way with an ending to CapEx for future fossil fuels now. They haven't been engaging with a fit for purpose plan. And of course, because they haven't been engaging, they're not getting those results. And in fact, most of the resolutions, even the most incrementalist and reformist ones, aren't winning. So you look at the whole enterprise of shareholder engagement, it's a lot of effort by very big investors, and they are diddling while Rome burns, and while they are wasting the investments because they have significant losses. And that was the importance of looking at the losses in the New York example. And so here's the really interesting thing. These investors could engage with a de minimis number of shares. They don't have to hold the pensioners' lifetime savings and engage with them. They can actually engage with a few shares. So I think we're reaching the point where as the losses, the financial losses mount, and the big institutional investors do a slow walk that'll shoot us way past 2 degrees Celsius, they are going to begin to be liable for suits themselves for violation of fiduciary duty. So in fact, this is a complete turnaround on fiduciary duty. And I just want to add one thing about the losses. So I told you that we completed our divestment by 2011. We had like a pesky hedge fund that we had to get rid of with like less than 1%. That took another year. So, completely by 2012. Every year since then, and we're fully ESG integrated, we have, 16% in climate solutions. Every year we have crushed our benchmarks by anywhere between 2 and 4%. Last year, our returns were 22%. So much so, those returns were so exciting. I sat down with my board and said, given the crisis of climate change and the crisis of our democracy, how can we grow our assets? How can we sit on our assets? And I said, please, let's take all these returns and put them right back into grant making. We doubled our grant making budget this year and put twice as much money into the divestment movement. So, support your activism on divestment. So, we have to really call the question now with the company, the institutional investors. So the As You Sow report laid out a challenge, and I think we reiterated that at the divestment press conference yesterday, that these folks that are persisting and engaging, it's time that they put a proposal to the companies that's time-bound. One last engagement, that they tender a 2 degrees business plan and the CapEx, tender that plan by 2020. If the companies refuse, and I'm kind of betting they're going to refuse given the history, but let's say, maybe the engagement would work. If the companies refuse, they are rogue global actors. Clearly, there's no other way you can look at them than that. And then the institutional investors must divest. They can't squander their beneficiaries' futures anymore.
So, as we just described, holding these fossil fuel companies is exceptionally or becoming extremely risky. And so it's absolutely right that any prudent fiduciary should be looking at how much of their portfolio is held in this risky sector and these individually risky companies. At the same time, when those prudent trustees reach the conclusion that they shouldn't hold them anymore, what happens is they sell them to somebody else. So this is the nub of the challenge, which is that you can protect your portfolio through divestment, and you'll have a fiduciary duty to protect your portfolio from financial risk. But that does leave these companies still out there with their business plans that are not aligned with Paris. So Share Action is a share activism organisation, and we were involved in a shareholder resolution at Royal Dutch Shell this spring. The resolution called for the company to align its business model through setting short and long-term targets with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Could not be simpler. This is what we need from every single, by the way, not just fossil fuel companies, but every single utility company, every single mining company. We need the world's major corporations to be on the plan around the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, this was filed by ourselves and 3,000 individuals in the Netherlands who'd each bought like a share in Shell. We had no support from the institutional investment community, who are the fiduciaries on behalf of millions of people all over the world. And Shell is still the biggest company in Europe. It's still, an absolute backbone of most European and certainly British pension fund portfolios, because the divestment movement hasn't quite caught on yet in the pension fund industry in the UK. So one of the things that's really interesting about what played out at Shell this spring is that it put the investors in a complete dither. Oh my God, they've all, by the way, and some of it's greenwashing, but some of it's increasingly sincere, have signed up to statements that say, we really support the Paris Agreement. So along comes a resolution at Shell saying, will Shell sign up for the, set targets to align with Paris? And they got in a real fix about what to do. Now, the reality was that a small number of them, thank you, did vote for our resolution. A bigger number of them couldn't bring themselves to vote for the resolution because it was kind of from this outsider group, but did actually make a public statement at the AGM, weirdly saying, we call on the board to set short and long-term targets to align with Paris. They just couldn't bring themselves to vote for our resolution. So that was sort of interesting. But these resolutions that set, the demands that we have to set, are really, really interesting for holding accountable the institutional investors, who are increasingly saying we can see that it's both devastating for our portfolios and devastating for the well-being of our beneficiaries if we don't align the corporate community with Paris. So I do actually think that there's a new generation of radical resolutions which will actually act to hold accountable the institutional investors, and that the divestment movement, along with doubling down on the call for divestment, because it absolutely is it's critical to protecting portfolios now, should be saying, but just sell everything bar one share and be in the fight to get these resolutions passed.
Can I add one thing, not to disagree with my friend Catherine?
Go ahead.
No. Actually, I would dicker a little bit about the shares, if they're sold or caught up quickly or bought up quickly by another investor. In fact, the companies are buying them back themselves. But what I would add to what you said is, actually, if these investors that are engaging with a more radical engagement frame, they would sure be a lot smarter to tie it to divestment and the threat of divestment. And that's starting to emerge. There's a few investors that are starting to do that, and that would bring some bite to it. But that is still way and by far on the margins, right? The mainstream engagement is not time-bound. It's going, next 5 years we want the companies to do X, Y, and Z, and then after 5 years, if they didn't do it, we'll rethink what we're going to do. Planet doesn't have time for that.
So a good example of that would be the Church of England, where they have now they passed a motion at Synod, which is their kind of parliament of the Church of England, saying we're going to engage till 2022, and if we haven't got the results, and this is now enforced, it will be enforced by the Church of England because they passed it as their own law, we will fully divest all of our Church of England portfolios. So that's an interesting example where they've set their own timetable. But what's important about that example is that the pressure for that came from the grassroots of the Church of England. The divestment movement in the Church of England has now had a really profound influence on the investment strategy and the engagement strategy, which is saying it's got to be Paris compliant engagement, and if you don't get the results by 2022, you must be out. So I think that's a really interesting example of that.
Can I riff off of that?
Yes, of course.
Okay, but it gets back to a question I know we talked about discussing. You know, on going back to this notion of fiduciary duty. First of all institutional investors are not the same, right? A foundation is a not-for-profit institutional investor, a not-for-profit investor. And a university is a not-for-profit investor. And a hospital endowment is a not-for-profit investor, and as is a faith body, like the Church of England. So think about this. You receive charitable tax status to serve the public good. If your investments are arguably undercutting the public good, you are in violation of your mission, which is your highest duty, not your returns on your endowment. So to go back to our example in 2008, when I was a brand new executive director for a month and the market crashed and we lost $100 million, and I was like, so, you know, I said to the board, well, when you interviewed me, we talked about this disconnect between your grants over here and your investments over there. Time to fix it. So we began this process of overhauling them, and it was clear to us that if with 5% of our assets, we were funding activism on climate change, some of the most progressive groups. And with the lion's share of our money, we were invested in ExxonMobil, we had a contradiction. And they're funding the denial of the science, and they're buying off politicians and lobbying for government inaction, and they were using our money as a war chest to deny the science and defeat our activists. So right there, you know you have a contradiction. So I think it's really important for activists that are pushing their faith groups, their universities, these non-profit institutions to say, actually Harvard, is your mission to grow the world's largest endowment that you don't use to support low-income people to attend your university, but just fund a whole bunch of investment professionals to make a lot of money? Is that your mission? Is that why you received charitable tax status? I don't think so. So I really think it's important in our advocacy that we distinguish between the not-for-profit investors and the others. Now, all of them are at risk in terms of finances, but the ethical responsibility is even greater for those not-for-profit institutions. But it's not just ethical, because you can dismiss ethical. It is literally mission-level responsibility not to damage the public good. And is there any issue other than climate change that you could make the argument that it impacts the mission of every institution, every foundation, every faith community? So, you know, peel back that argument and take it on.
This brings up a question about further frontiers. I completely buy what you're saying about nonprofits. What about, I was at dinner last night with a bunch of corporate leaders, all of whom have pension funds, and all of whom are making all kinds of statements about their, you know, they have sustainability mission statements and sustainability reports and sustainability officers. And what do you think? Do you think we have some chance of starting to hold bringing corporations on board in this fight as well?
Can I
Please.
respond to that? Yeah. So I think one of the super interesting things that's going on right now is how you know, and it's amazing, we're seeing this at GCAS this week, how many corporations actually are stepping up and doing, and the arguments they give are sustainability or failure to take account of huge risks like climate change could be very damaging to our business models. So we're really focused on this as a risk. And yet their employee retirement plans seem to be totally comfortable with huge amounts of exactly that risk and there is just this complete failure to do the joined-up thinking. And actually, I think it's very interesting in terms of companies saying, but we really care about our people. People are our greatest asset, but it's an asset we're not going to look after from the point of view of protecting from that risk. But we're really busy protecting the business model against that, which is great. But there is a huge amount of requirement to call that out. Now, the best place for that to come from is the employees themselves. And we really need to have a more empowered approach by pension fund members. And by the way, we're beginning to see it in Australia.
Yes.
So I don't know if you are aware of a young hero, 23 years old, called Mark McVeigh, who is suing REST superannuation scheme, which is one of the big superannuation schemes in the US, for a failure, Australia, for a failure to inform him, which they have a duty to do, about climate risk. So the Australian pension fund industry has a legal obligation in Australian law to inform fund members about financial risk. But REST and many other superannuation schemes in Australia say nothing about climate. And this young man says, but climate is a material risk. By the time I come to retire, which for someone of 23 is some decades away, then the world could be ravaged by runaway climate change, impacting my portfolio, impacting my life. I think that's a risk you should maybe have told me something about. And it'll be so interesting to see how that case proceeds, and because hopefully that will be upheld by the courts, and then immediately every single superannuation scheme in Australia will have to quickly put something in. So I think this, and similarly, I've been talking to a woman who used to work for JP Morgan, but is now, she still has a retirement fund with JP Morgan, and she's willing, and many others are emerging, and I just would ask every single one of you in the room to consider this. Will you be part of a movement where we start mobilizing people to write? We've got a whole amazing set of lawyers that will help us with getting the arguments right. We've obviously got incredible evidence like that from Carbon Tracker and other organizations around the financial case. We've got the legal arguments, we've got the financial case. We need the troops, we need people that will write and say, I think you're in breach of duty. What are you going to do about it? Because I think once a few schemes start to respond to that, everyone else has to start to. So I think this is one of the really exciting directions we can take the movement right now.
Powerful, among other things, because the activist logic of divestment from the beginning was this was something that everybody, you didn't necessarily live near a coal mine, but you had some exposure to some pot of money that was somehow implicated. And I think we've come to feel that more strongly, with each passing year. I now say over and over again, and I think it's really the truth, that money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns, and that cutting it off is the key. So, it's been a great pleasure to watch the universe of possible kind of either targets or partners in this effort expand. We began really just thinking about people who we thought had a kind of strong moral connection, so universities or churches or things, but moved in all kinds of directions since. This seems like the next logical sort of build out in a way, to get as many people as possible. I have no idea why TIAA, CREF, or people like that think that it's just okay to be funding the destruction of the planet. So I hope that that becomes, because I think we can, in the same way that when you talk about getting thousands of people writing letters, we need to be doing what Amnesty International did so powerfully around prisoners or whatever else, and I think we can do it. We're almost out of time. Let me ask one more set of questions just along these same lines. The other interesting thing that's happening at the moment is, or one of the other interesting things, is the emergence of these large-scale litigation against fossil fuel companies for their role in creating the set of damages. So we've seen cities suing state governments, all kinds of people beginning to sue. How does that interact with the argument around divestment, around risk, around exposure, and so on? are these, is there, I guess what I'm sort of asking is this a kind of useful kind of pincer move almost?
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously, legal action against companies is something that they have to disclose in their report accounts and so on, and it is highly material to their valuations, and so it's a crucial part of the pincer strategy. But I do think we need to come both from the perspective of the companies being sued and from the fiduciaries of institutional investment organizations being sued. And if I may, I just want to mention quite a powerful little piece of research that ShareAction released on yesterday in time for GCAS. So we last year took over a fantastic little NGO that was looking for a new home called the Asset Owner Disclosure Project. And yesterday we released a ranking from 1 to 100 of the 100 largest public pension funds in the world. How are they doing on climate change risk? So I have to tell you that 37 of the largest public pension funds in the world are US based, which is just an indication of the sheer size of your economy and the incredible wealth in the United States. A very large proportion of the X-rated funds who put absolutely no information whatsoever in the public arena, are utterly secretive about how they're managing climate change or how they assess it, are US public pension funds. And there are some fantastic exceptions to that. And by the way, they all come in states where there's an incredible grassroots divestment and climate change movement. So the best funds are on the coasts. But there's just a horrible long list of Illinois, Indiana, Oregon, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, New Jersey, that's on the coast, I know, Tennessee, Utah, West Virginia. These are funds that really need 350.org and everyone else in the movement saying, we're coming after you. And we need SEIU involved, because we just really have to go after the funds that are just so negligent in managing the risk and being transparent and accountable on the risk. Because it's the pension fund members, but actually in all of these instances, it's the taxpayers. Everyone has an interest in managing this risk. So I think there's kind of work to be done, and I brought a handout if anyone's interested with all that list of funds. And we would love at ShareAction to help and work with you guys over here and making sure that these laggards step up.
Can I just punctuate two really important points? They were said, but I want to punctuate them. The one is that the mere existence of these lawsuits, particularly there's a lot of different types of climate litigation, and our foundation works in that space, but the ones that are actually suing the companies for damages, those are putting investors on notice that this is another threat to the companies themselves. So as fiduciaries, that's another big chunk of information as to why there's a risk to your portfolio. So yes, it is absolutely doubling down on the fiduciary risk that already exists for all the other reasons we discussed. But secondly, I want to punctuate what Catherine said, is that if you run a retirement account, as Bill was saying, like all these retirement accounts, whether they're corporate, whether they're university retirement accounts, whether they're foundation retirement accounts, if you run a retirement account and you are approached by your beneficiaries who ask if there's a climate risk to their investments, to their retirement, if they ask that and the retirement accounts do not respond or don't provide fossil-free options, there is a strong basis for going after them. And we need to figure out how to do that. There was an effort to sue Harvard, and I think there's ample opportunity, but it has to be tied to the activism in really clear strategic ways.
The right note on which to end, the activism, I'm sorry? We can, oh good. Let me just see, as we're recording, we need you to carefully, in the slight dim murk of the room, to come down the stairs without breaking anything and ask a question from the microphone. And tell us who you are as you do it.
Hi, thanks so much. I really appreciated your call to action, and my first question would be, can you put a template up so that if we go to dinner parties and we know people who actually have pensions, we can get them to write
That's exactly what we need. Yes.
And my name is Kaya Axelson, and I attend Oxford University, where some of my friends were working very hard with Archbishop to try to push that initiative that you spoke about. And they were actually very frustrated with the outcome because their hope was that they could get the Church of England to divest from any company that didn't make a net neutral plan by 2020. Instead, they ended up with the TPI ratings, which come out of the London School of Economics, I know, rivalry. And instead, what that says is that Shell and BP, which are in the TPI ratings, are rated A+, according to those ratings. So I'm a little concerned when we talk about divestment that we celebrate these victories, but then we get caught in the weeds because the rating systems we're using are very complex, and often we don't look into them. And how can we help standardize or create principles to encourage real divestment?
So you're right that a lot of people in the Church of England were disappointed because they wanted full divestment now, and what they got was a commitment to divest with an engagement strategy that gets there. And I, for one, do defend that because I think that we do actually need this combination of resolutions and shareholder activism that call for Paris-compliant business models from these companies with the threat of divestment at a short time away, but with enough time to play out that strategy. So, but I know that there was very mixed feelings, and I also, by the way, there is a real dilemma around holding up the different companies. I mean, there is no such thing as a sustainable fossil fuel company. The reality is some of them are less awful than others, and that makes Shell in particular look kind of a bit okay, like compared to Exxon maybe, or compared to... So we have to be so careful with benchmarking these companies against, if you benchmark something hideous against something else hideous, you can get something looking less hideous, and it is still hideous, and it needs to be called out. So we have to be very careful with that.
Right, and
Fully
that's,
agree.
and that's really important. I think any talk around engagement at all has to be, the benchmark has to be against physics. That's the question here.
Yeah.
Not against, there's no best in category.
That's how it's done.
I know, and second, and most importantly, and I think it's the thing that you guys have been stressing above all, time is no longer our friend in this fight. Solutions that offer themselves in 2025 or 2030 or 2035 are not solutions. They are ways to delay things past the point where solutions are possible. So that's to me, Ellen, you've talked about slow walking, and I think that's exactly the right term, and it drives me nuts to watch investment committees forever say, well, we need another study or another, given the physical parameters of climate change, that's crucial.
Okay. Oh, we have time for one more question.
One more question.
Okay. Ooh. That's a big responsibility to be the last question. I asked this question this morning, and it's an honest question. I'm beginning to work on divestment from war. And what I'm wondering about is whether the same language that you're using for divestment from fossil fuel and other, insults to the climate and so on, is the same language you would use for that.
Right, because it's the fossil fuel divestment movement has been so successful. It's just taken this entire word divestment and claimed it all for itself, which is quite funny. Because actually, the divestment movement, the fossil fuel divestment movement, took its inspiration in many ways from the South African divestment movement, from other divestment movements in tobacco. There's an amazing tobacco-free portfolios movement, and absolutely we need to divest from war. So, but we partly need to divest from fossil fuels because a climate-ravaged world is a world full of war. tragically enough, and we're already seeing that in Syria, I would say. So it's all interconnected, and we have to divest from those individual things, but we have to engage with the problem.
Yeah, the thing that I would add to that is, when we, just taking it to the example of our foundation, when we made the decision to overhaul our investments, we didn't just make the decision to get out of fossil fuels. We have a whole range of screens of companies and industries that we don't want to be a part of, including weapons. And we have goals around things that we do want to invest in the ways that we want to change the world. And I think that there are always going to be good examples about how this can be done in financially prudent ways, and so that you maintain a certain level of return that can maintain the business of operations of the investment fund. But I will say, so we're out of a lot of things, and I've been involved in a lot of these movements that have used finance as a tool for social change. And that's really what divestment campaigning is about, is using finance as our leverage, our base of power, to take on corporations who have, infinite power. But I will say something about this movement that has been so magical is because of this alignment of ethical and financial and fiduciary imperatives in a way that is so clear. And so some of these other issues are often being led by the ethical arguments, and you have to defend the financial, and should, because it is wrong to be invested in guns, in instruments of war. I believe, and our foundation believes. But the thing about the divestment movement is, it's incontrovertible, it's stupid to be, financially stupid, to be invested in the fossil fuels as well. So, I think the ethical arguments are the same, the financial arguments are somewhat different, but you have to defend the financial arguments to be successful.
As we end, let me just say, I'm sorry that we didn't have time for more questions, because I rambled on as usual, but we should take, this is going to be a rough week. I mean, the things that will happen here in San Francisco are great, but we're going to be watching maybe one of the most destructive hurricanes ever to hit the continent, and tons of people are going to suffer, and we're going to be able to try and help them afterwards, but at this point, there's nothing we can do to keep it from happening. It's a good reminder of why we need to move fast, and out of that despair, we also need to hold on to what's been the extraordinary joy of this work. It's been just remarkable to watch how people of all different kinds have figured out how to make common cause here. And I'm, for one, extremely excited by this conversation this afternoon and the kind of notion that we can expand the sphere in which we're doing this work, that we live in, to use a bad combative term, a target-rich environment. And I'm a bad enough human being that there are days when, even if I'm not feeling particularly hopeful about the climate fight, it's enough to get me going. Just the thought of causing trouble for bad guys is keep me fully engaged. So many thanks to all of you for all your work, and we'll do a lot more down the road. Thank you two so much.
We've got Dan Zarelli, Lisa Ann Hamilton, and Casey Burrell. We'll set that up. We'll be right back with you.